Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar about Handicap Committee responsibilities. My name is Jason Funderburg. I'm going to be moderating some of the questions today. I'm joined by Steve Latos and Mario Mackey from our Member Services Department. Mario is going to be in the questions section, helping to answer any questions we can't get to in the Q&A section. Just a reminder, today we are going to be recording this presentation and posting it on our website later on. We're going to have that link as well up on the screen. And I would also encourage everyone to submit any questions that you have. We will filter through them, and if we can't get through to them today, we'll respond to you guys personally as we have all your contact info. So now I'm going to pass it over to Steve Latos, Manager of GIN Technical Support here at GAP. Steve?
Thank you, Jason, and good morning, everyone. Looking forward to today's session regarding the Handicap Committee responsibilities. And we'll go into a low-level detail of some of these responsibilities that the club has. We do realize there's a lot of specific situations that come up at a club. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. We'll try to get to them as best as possible. So we wanted to start by defining what a handicap committee is. And that's defined by the rules of handicapping as something that's established by a golf club and its responsibility for ensuring compliance with the golf club's specified obligations and responsibilities under the rules of handicapping. So new for this year is the rules of handicapping. It was a collaboration with the USGA and 5 other governing bodies throughout the world to come up with one set of handicapping rules. So some of the rules that we had used in the USGA system in the past have changed a little bit, and with that, the committee takes on an increased role. Now, not everything is covered in the rules of handicapping. There's also an additional handicap committee guide. This is something that was separate because it's not meant to overwhelm the player that might want to look at the rules of handicapping. These were responsibilities that the handicap committee specifically has. So this can be obtained. It's currently in a draft process as it's being finalized, but once it is finalized, we will be able to communicate with clubs on a distribution method for that. It will also be available online. This document, at least right now, is 39 pages of detailed information. So again, it's something that we reference quite a bit, and not only that, but in addition to the rules of handicapping. So this handles all the detailed questions. So it's something that we rely on at GAP quite a bit, and can also be relied on to handle some of the nuanced things that happen at a club as well. So again, we're talking more general stuff today, but some of the more detailed information can be found in here as well. So again, it goes into the detailed situations and specific controls of the committee. We're going to pick out a couple of those important slides here today. So before we get into the committee's responsibilities, we want to talk about establishing a committee and how that looks like. So again, it is something that each club must have per the rules of handicapping. And it should be an odd number of members, and this is to ensure that any ties are broken in a voting process. So common in our region to see 3 to 7, some as high as 9, but in that 5 to 7 range is typically a good sweet spot to get differing opinions and also have it be an odd number so ties can be broken. Should be chaired by a member of the club. This is important. It shouldn't be chaired by a staff member or an employee at the club because that then has a direct conflict of interest for that individual. Obviously, they're trying to bring in members and keep their members happy. If there's a decision that needs to be made that could compromise someone's status at the club, that's where the unique conflict of interest stands. However, it can include the employee, and this is something that we would recommend, is a lot of times the employee is in direct contact with us at GAP, so it's a nice liaison between us at the Authorized Golf Association and the club. So they can participate and have a voting right, or they can just be in there as an advisory role. They typically have an enhanced knowledge of the handicap product or system, so having their knowledge and being able to guide discussion is always good. So again, an employee can be on there, but it should not be cannot be the chair of that committee. Something that we can't recommend enough is developing something like a procedures and policies and procedures document, something in writing. So when any situation arises throughout the year, you have an objective guideline to follow, so you're not so a member doesn't feel slighted if a certain decision is made that adversely impacts them. So this is the best way to handle situations in an objective way. We can provide examples of a certain type of documents. We do know there's one club specifically that does a really good job, has a 3-page document that says exactly how they go about peer review and auditing procedures at the committee. But again, this is something just to hedge anything down the road. If you have something in writing, you're treating every member in a fair way, and you're not taking any subjective measures into play. So once that committee is established, there's 10 roles outlined by the committee guideline book that has an enhanced opportunity for committee to establish. We're going to pick out 4 of those and talk about those, as we saw that those pertain the most, especially with the launch of the new rules of handicapping. So those 4, we'll have a slide on each of them, or a couple slides on each of them, but it's knowing the rules and getting educated on those. It's facilitating the timely submission of scores. That has an increased importance in the rules of handicapping. We'll talk about that. And then the control of applying penalty scores and adjusting the handicap index. We kind of combine those 2 into one bullet point, essentially making sure that each member has an index that reflects their demonstrated ability. So the first part of that is knowing the rules of handicapping. Again, this is new since the rules of handicapping is something that just launched in 2020. And with that, there's an educational requirement that each club is required to pass. So to become certified in the rules of handicapping, each club is required to have a committee member score at least 80% on a test to demonstrate their knowledge of the rules. A lot of clubs have already satisfied this requirement. GAP was, before COVID-19 hit, GAP was fortunate enough to host 5 this year and 5 in last year. Seminars to go over the rules of handicapping, and we administered a test at the end of this. So a lot of clubs have already fulfilled this, but there are some clubs still outstanding. We can pass along a link that has an online webinar, a series of videos produced by the USGA that has the quiz at the end, and you're able to take the quiz there. So we can distribute that to clubs that still need to do that, so they are certified. Once being certified, we rely a lot on the handicap committee to be on the front line for their members asking questions. We definitely take a lot of questions at GAP regarding handicapping, but with 75,000 members, there could be a lot of questions, and if the club can help with that process and before getting to us, that's always a good thing for all those involved. So some common questions that we get a lot at GAP are which scores are acceptable. Or someone plays 14 holes, they might not know if they can post that score or not, or if it's a certain type of format, they don't know if they can post that. So guidance on that is always appreciated. And then a lot of it, especially now with the new rules of handicapping, is some of the calculations. So index, course handicap, what the maximum hole score is for net double bogey, things like that, especially at the start of this year, I've been getting a lot of questions on that. And then lastly, educating on peer review. Peer review will always remain a key component of the rules of handicapping in any handicapping system. So ensuring that players know how to participate in peer review and double check that members have indexes that reflect their demonstrated ability is always a pillar of that system. So a good way to get this information in the hands of members is communication. So that can be using newsletters, using the website to promote information and have that policies document on the website, periodic emails to relay information. We've even seen some clubs and committees this year doing in-person seminars for their club to educate on the new rules. So any touch point that you can have with your members, if you are a committee member, is always a good way just to emphasize some of the new rules and down the road emphasize what's important going forward. So again, with the rules of handicapping this year, the timely submission of scores takes on an increased importance for a couple of reasons. So the committee should always educate players on how they can post scores and really emphasize that it should be done the day that they play. So some options that are listed here, and we did have a webinar that Mario did earlier this year on how to post a score. So we do recommend if at your club you know that some players are delayed in posting scores, that webinar is found on our webinar page and can be sent out. It goes over all these methods that are listed, which are the GIN mobile app, GIN.com, the Gap Locker, and the score posting kiosk at the club, which might take a backseat now as it's a touch point and we want to eliminate any type of contact we can get. But those are 4 bona fide options that players can use to post their score. Especially with the app, it's something that can be done instantaneously. It's as easy as sending a text out. player should have their score posted by the time they leave the club. So there's really no excuse for that. So why it's important that scores are submitted immediately? There's three main reasons for that. Number one, so they're available immediately for peer review. If you play with someone from your club on, say, a Monday, and that player doesn't post till Thursday, there's a good chance that you might not check that if it's not posted that late. But if it's posted that Monday and you log back in the next day and you want to see what did they post that day, you want to make sure it's there and available to ensure that that player's scoring history is correct. The other two, so that was something that was important in the old system as well. As soon as it was on there, was something that can be viewed by fellow members of the club. But the last two bullet points are new for this year. So the playing conditions calculation, we did do another webinar on that as well. And essentially with the playing conditions calculation, it's a method that adjusts the score differentials for players if the conditions of the course vary are extreme on a given day. And that calculation only happens once a day, and it's at midnight of that day. So if a score is not posted on the day that a player plays, then it won't be included in that playing conditions calculation. And with that, it could impact every single player that played the course that day if a player did not post their score that could have impacted that PCC number. And then lastly, and Handicap Index now updates daily. So if a score is not posted that day, it would not be included for the nightly Handicap Index revision. So the player, if they played on consecutive days, their index would not reflect that last score if they didn't post on the day that they played. So again, three main reasons why posting on the day of play is important, and that is the committee's responsibility to make sure players are doing so. So we'll stop now before going into a couple other key features. Jason, were there any questions?
Yep, a couple questions roll in. Just a reminder, everybody, you can find that questions tab in the window pane of the GoToWebinar app. First question for you, Steve, is how often should my club's handicap committee meet?
So that's a good question. And there's nothing written down that has a specific guideline for that. But we would say monthly would be a good, some periodic schedule, whether it be monthly or quarterly. A specific schedule where you are reviewing things that are going on at the club. Obviously, with what it is today, where it's more difficult to meet in person, that could be provide some challenges as well. But virtual meetings would work as well. But monthly, quarterly, something to have a reasonable schedule, and then potentially on call if there's a situation that arises at a club that needs immediate action. It might require a meeting that happens at that minute.
Second one rolled in here. Should we have separate committees for men and women?
Again, no guidance on that. We do know some clubs that do. It just kind of depends on the composition of the club. So it certainly is possible, but not required. So again, no guidance, but the club has the authority to make that decision.
Perfect. Well, that's it for questions for now. Just a reminder, everybody, you can submit those at any time, and we will have two more question and answer slides before the end.
All right, thank you. So the next part, and this one can be potentially a contentious one, is the use of penalty scores. So a penalty score is a score posted at the discretion of the handicap committee for a player who does not submit an acceptable score when required. So most of the time, the reason for this action is if a player plays and posts a score that wouldn't go in the direction that they're hoping their handicap to go. So it could be a player that wants their handicap low so they can qualify for a certain event and they play a poor round and don't post it, or vice versa, where a player wants their index to increase a little bit so they get that extra stroke in the club championship coming up or the member guest, and they don't post a good score because it would bring their handicap index down. So this goes into a player manipulating their scoring record for their own benefit. So if the committee sees that this is happening, they can post a penalty score on a record without notifying the player. It's not required that they say, we see that you haven't been posting scores, we're going to add a penalty score. As far as the administration in this is something that's done in the GIN software, the GIN admin portal, so the golf shop staff can assist in posting that score. So again, this is another reason why it might be beneficial to have a staff member as either a consultant or a member of the committee. And what that penalty score is it would be equal to either the highest or lowest score differential in the player's most recent 20 scores. So it's if a player that's trying to have their index go down so they can qualify for a certain event, and they don't post a high score, what the committee could do is post the highest score differential in their most recent 20 scores. On the flip side, if it was a potential sandbag situation where a player's index, they're trying to avoid it from going down, the committee could post the score differential that was the lowest in their most recent 20 scores. So that's how it would be applied. We've got a chart for when it should be applied on this slide. So I apologize, it is a little blurry. We did try to blow it up a little bit so it could be more easily read. So top of that chart is asking for why the reason a player hasn't submitted their score. So all the way on the left-hand side as we drop down, if the player did not complete the round for valid reasons, if they were sick, the light was running out, a reason that they couldn't actually post that score, the score shouldn't be posted. No disciplinary needs to take place. It was a legitimate reason for why the score wasn't posted. Another example of this we see a lot at clubs that audit their tee sheet is if they play a format that wasn't postable. So maybe someone signed up to play in an alternate shot, or they were playing alternate shot with a couple friends, and when the shop goes and looks, hey, this person was on the tee sheet but didn't post their score, playing an unacceptable or unpostable round of golf would be a valid reason as well. Move over to that middle column. If a player doesn't submit a score for no valid reason, so they forgot or didn't know if the score was acceptable, so essentially it was just a mistake, the committee should then post that score, either 9 or 18 holes, depending on how it was acceptable. And if this continues to be a problem, if someone continues to forget, and it might be an honest mistake, but it continues to happen, maybe disciplinary action would be the course of action. Because once that penalty score is on the record, it would force the player to understand the severity. And then on the far right-hand side, that's essentially the worst-case scenario, where the committee concludes the player didn't post their score because they were trying to gain an unfair advantage. So with that, there's kind of two methods you take from there. So if you know what the score was and the player didn't post it, that score should be posted. And then in addition to that, you post a penalty score. And then if the score is not known, so if the player doesn't post a score and you're pretty sure that they didn't post it because they were trying to manipulate the system but didn't know exactly what it was, you can apply the penalty score, but that specific round wouldn't have to be posted. And with those two situations, disciplinary action is even more considered outside of just the penalty score. If reasons to manipulate the index continue to be a problem, there might be more that's required than just putting a penalty score on the record. So that would be kind of the flow of when to submit a penalty score, and then actually applying it to the record. On the right-hand side, we have a member on our staff that took a lot of pride in becoming a single-digit handicap player. And as the strict handicap committee at the GAP offices, we wanted to make sure we were fair instead of just having a vanity 9.9 index. So we did apply a penalty score to a player on our staff. You can see it right here. So what it does is it has a score type of P. And in this case, because the player was trying to manipulate the system to be a little bit lower, we put the score that was equal to the greatest differential in that player's most recent 20 scores, which in this case was a 19.7. So that was the penalty score and how it looks on the gym products once it's applied. So kind of in addition to that is the handicap committee's ability to adjust an index. So what the handicap committee needs to make sure of is that every single player in their club has a handicap index that reflects their demonstrated ability. And sometimes this doesn't happen. So the rules of handicapping does a great job of accomplishing this mission, but there's outlier opportunities and things that happen that sometimes require an adjustment. Injury would definitely be the number one thing for that. A junior player that's improving rapidly, things that the controls in the rules of handicapping don't automatically address. So when the committee notices that a player's index does not reflect their demonstrated ability, they can adjust the index. And when they do that, they have to make sure the player is involved in the process. So that means they know what the level of adjustment is. And you can see on the bottom right hand corner of the screen here, there's a couple ways to modify the handicap index. The screenshot, and this comes from the USGA admin portal, so it's something that the club has the control to do. One thing is to adjust score differentials. So this would take the last 20 scores and adjust those differentials by a certain number, and you can either do that upward or downwards. So using this method is a good way to have that modification phased out, because as soon as a player starts posting scores after that adjustment, part of those adjustments get phased out. So if an adjustment happens and a player posts 5 scores, 5 of those scores that were adjusted come out of the most recent 20. So it's a way to phase out the adjustment. The other method, which we don't have a screenshot for, that says set handicap index, that was where you just put a static number. So let's say the player is a 15.0 and they were injured, and their last 3 scores after injury had differentials of 20, 22, 24. They're clearly not a 15.0 because of that injury, and you could set that index to a specific number like 20 or 19.5. And you could also have an expiration date of when that happens. So then lastly, the player needs to be made aware of how long it applies. With adjusting score differentials, that's easy. It'll last as long as those 20 scores are in the record to some extent. And then when you use the set handicap index method, that's when the committee can decide when the modification would expire. And with that, we always recommend to always periodically check in. So if a player that was injured and you adjusted their handicap index upward and you did it for 1 month, and let's say that player plays 15 times in 15 days and their scores start to get back down to that 15.0 number, maybe you can remove that modification even though it was set originally for a month. Or after the month, you realize that player is never going to get back down to 15.0, but the system's already done a good job of correcting, so it can be removed. So that's kind of a gray area, more of an art than a science, but the player should be made aware of how long that initial adjustment will apply. And one last thing we want to touch on before we got to questions is the current situation with COVID-19. We have gotten a ton of questions, especially here in our GAP region where with Pennsylvania last Friday and New Jersey last Saturday, courses are now being allowed to open and players to play golf. So on March 20th, in anticipation of this, the USGA released some guidelines to address the specific aspects of golf that have been altered by COVID-19. So this can be found on usga.org. If you go to the handicapping section, it's one of the first articles there. And essentially the main part of this that we've been getting the most questions about is the club's open, but there's a modification to the hole, whether it's a raised cup or a pool noodle in the middle, and I can't hole out, what should I do? So anything that was addressed by modification of the hole can be addressed with using the most likely score, and this is in rule 3.3 of the rules of handicapping. So 2 parts of that. The first, this is taken from the rules of handicapping, a graph from 3.3. So if your ball's within 5 feet of the hole, you can add 1 additional stroke. And if the ball's between 5 feet and 20 yards, you can add 2 or 3, depending on some factors like where the ball is and the ability of the player. So if it's in the bunker, it'll be 3, unless you're a really good bunker player and think you can get it up and down. If it's a 15-footer, it would be 2. So that's one component of it. The other component would be if it is a raised cup or something that the ball wouldn't be holding in, you can use your own judgment, where if you roll the ball at, even if it's a 6-footer and you putt towards that raised cup, if it doesn't hit it, obviously you wouldn't mark that as hold. If it hit it really hard and you don't think it would have gone in had the cup been raised, you can assume that it wouldn't have been hold. So essentially what you would have scored had the hole not be modified is the guidance from these rules. There's also additional guidances like what you do with bunkers and some controls the committee has there, and then scorecards, since obviously that would be another touch point. So there's more detailed information on that we won't really get into too much. But in all of this, GAP still strongly recommends that the club allows posting during this time. There are these guidelines. We want to make sure that when players go out that they can post a score that's reflective of their demonstrated ability. And the USGA has done a great job in allowing that to happen. So with that, Jason, we will pause here for questions before getting into the competition committee.
Yep, they are flowing in now, Steve. First question here is more of an example question, but a player plays 9 holes and practices several shots / putts during the round. Is the player required to post a score for this 9-hole round?
So when a player is practicing and hitting additional balls, that's actually in the rules of handicapping, and that is a score that's not acceptable for posting. So if they're playing multiple balls, 9 or 18 holes, doesn't matter, that score should not be posted.
Gotcha. Next one up here, for habitual offenders, what are the next steps after a second offense, i.e. Like a ban from club tournaments?
Yeah, so that's one option. Another option that we haven't really talked about, I guess we didn't want to get too dark on this one, is you could withdraw a handicap index. So that would be the player's index would go to NH, which means they don't have a handicap index, and then they obviously wouldn't be able to compete there. So that would probably be something established in the procedures and policies. If you have, typically a 3-strike warning would be good. First strike, you get a warning. Second strike, we post a penalty score. If it happens again, withdraw the index.
Right. And last one here for this section, can an adjustment be made for a player that consistently scores better than their index in net competitions?
Yeah, so the committee has a lot of controls here. There is something known as the Knuth point system that we use at GAP, where it's based on performance at events. So if your player earns points depending on where they finish in that competition, so a player that always finishes first, even if they're not outperforming their handicap index, could get docked for future events. So what it does is, depending on the amount of points you have, the index is docked a certain amount of points. We also know of clubs doing other things. I know just singling out a couple clubs, Commonwealth National Golf Club has a tournament handicap system where it looks at scores that are posted in tournaments and uses that versus the actual handicap to whichever one's lower they use for their net tournaments. Then I believe Mark Rosenberg from Bluebell Country Club is on this call too. He's established a system as well that looks at just how often a player performs based on the probability of what their index is. So yeah, there's a lot of controls out there. If a player continues to outperform their score, the committee can further reduce the handicap index.
All right, we're all finished with questions for this section. Please feel free to keep them rolling in, guys.
All right, great. So what we just talked about was the handicap committee. There's also, a club should also have a competition committee that is separate from the handicap committee established from each club. And we'll talk about it later, but there are mutual interests of each of these committees. But the handicap committee, their main goal is to make sure every member at the course has an index that reflects their demonstrated ability. The competition committee then runs the events at the club. So some things that the competition committee does that the handicap committee wouldn't have essentially a say in is setting the maximum index or playing handicap for an event, eligibility requirements, so what it takes to get into the event, allowances, so if we're not using 100% of the handicap index, and then new for this year is choosing which index to use for the event. In the past, it was pretty easy because if you ran an event on May 10th, you could use the index from May 1st since it only updated twice a month. But now you have a little bit more flexibility on what index to use for that event, and then potentially modifying the index for the event. So this would again come down to what the last question we just had is if a player continues to perform better in events. It's probably done at the competition level rather than the handicap level. And again, this could either be a situation where a player's done well in events in the past or they play better at a certain course. So some flexibility with the index in that specific event. So eligibility requirements, took a screenshot on the left-hand side of the page here. This was from the GAP Middle Amateur Championship. So not only was there a eligibility requirement of age, since it was mid-am, you had to be 25 or older, but we also put a eligibility requirement on index. So the maximum index for this event was 7.0 or lower. So we see this all over the place. Some clubs actually have maximum or minimum indexes where you have to be a 10 handicap to play in a certain event. Or with flights, you're eligible for certain flights depending on where your index is, things like that. So that's something decided by the competition committee. That's just to get into the event. Then once in the event, the competition committee has the ability to make a maximum handicap index or plain handicap. So let's say for a specific event, the eligibility was you needed to be a 40.0 index to get in, but once you're in, we're going to cut it off 36.4 as the highest index. And then the plain handicap, which again is what the index is calculated after looking at the slope rating and any allowances, you can make a maximum for that as well. So those are two decisions the committee has. Honestly, we don't see a whole lot of the image on the right where there's maximum indexes and plain handicaps. A little more common is the eligibility, but we do see both depending on the club and event. Another thing the competition committee can decide is the handicap allowances. So these are recommended to provide equity in individual and team competitions. Important to note here that the allowances aren't meant to make the field 100% even. What it is, it's allowing everyone to have, I think it was to finish top 20% of a specific event. So this gives everyone, it's not for winning an event, it's giving everyone an equal chance to finish in the top 10 or 20% of that event. So if you're more concerned about giving everyone an equal chance to win the event, these allowances would have to be a little lower, which would be a competition committee decision to make those allowances lower than the ones suggested to finish in the top portion of the field. So these are new under the new rules of handicapping, and they are now the same for men and women. In the past, they had been there had been some areas where it was different for men and women. I think 4-ball was 85% for ladies and 95% for men, or vice versa. Now it's just 90% for both genders. So this is in the rules of handicapping. Something can be referenced, but these are guidelines again. The competition committee can go further. So if they had 4-ball match play and they thought 90% wasn't stringent enough, they could decide to make that new allowance 80% instead. And we talked about choosing the index. Now that in the rules of handicapping, an index updates daily. So before it was a little easier to choose which index it was for an event. Now you have a little bit more flexibility. The screenshot on the bottom is from USGA Tournament Management. There's now an update method new for this year where you can choose to update the index on a specific date. And if you click on this box, a full calendar will come up and you can choose which date to use for an update. So in this case, I use May 1st. So our recommendation at GAP is to use the date as close as possible to the start of the event. So we want the indexes as fresh as possible, but on the other side, still having enough time to perform administrative duties. So this, it might vary on an event-to-event basis. For a large member guest where you have multiple flights and you might print a scoreboard from a third party and you want those flights known in advance, it might be a week in advance that you use that handicap index from. But if it's a league that's at 5 o'clock and you have staff that comes in at 6 a.m. that can update the indexes right away, the same day would be the absolute best way to do it. So at GAP, we're doing everything 7 days in advance. That ensures that we have enough time to print any scoreboards or scorecards that we need to do, but still be close enough to the start of an event. So we're using a standard 7 days from GAP. At the club, it kind of varies on the club's personnel and decision-making by the committee. So again, as close as possible is recommended, but you still don't want to be in any situations where you're short on time and printing out materials for that event or round. The USGA strongly encourages the handicap index to remain unchanged between rounds on consecutive days. So this would be like a member guest. So on a member guest, if it's multiple days, obviously the scores from that first day should be posted. And when those scores are posted at midnight of that day, the index will revise. For administrative purposes, we're not recommending, the USGA is not recommending to change the index for the second day of that event. Again, that just puts a stress on the staff. They have enough stuff going on already. It brings air into play. So the recommendation just for administrative ease is to keep that same index for both days of a multiple day competition. Now, if it's something like a season-long match play, that obviously wouldn't be the case, where you have until May 1st to finish your first round and then June 1st to finish your second round. The index should be changed in between those two rounds where they're not on consecutive days. So the handicap committee and competition committee are separate, but they do have some natural mutual interest. Number one is establishing a schedule to encourage play for all members. You don't want a situation where every club event is for high handicappers or low handicappers. So working with each committee to ensure that there's a wide variety of interest for any type of player to play in events. Obviously, that's the most important thing. We want to facilitate participation in events, and that can be done if each committee looks at the schedule to accomplish that. Again, posting the score on the day of play. We mentioned back on one of the first slides that ensuring that scores are posted on the day of play is important for a variety of reasons. When the competition committee runs an event, they have the control to then post that score. So in USGA Tournament Management, there's an easy post scores function that after all scores are posted, that the committee can easily post those scores. So that's important to ensure, especially for a club event where there might be 100 to 140 players playing, to make sure that those scores are all considered for the playing conditions calculation. Designating score type. This is not as important as it was in the past. The exceptional score reduction now deals with players shooting good scores. It considers all score types, not just tournament type. So in the past, it was really important to designate which score should be designated as a tournament, since that could apply for reductions later down the road. But score type still is important in the rules of handicapping, more for that sorting and filtering. So if you had the new format for tournament scores is a C score for competition. So if you had the suspicion that a player was playing better in competitions, you could easily filter by that C score for competition. So just making sure of when the competitions should be designated so it can be sorted by the handicap committee in future use. On stroke index allocation, the rules of handicapping says the committee should establish the stroke index allocation. It doesn't really provide guidance on that, whether that should be the competition or handicap committee. So it's kind of a joint effort. We did have a webinar on stroke index allocation that will be posted on our webinar page as well. It has changed with the new rules of handicapping. So making sure that the handicap committee with net double bogey and the competition committee where the strokes fall during the competition are on the same page with that stroke index allocation. So with that, we have referenced a couple of these webinars that we've done in the past. So for those of you, we've seen a lot of familiar names, which has been great. But for those that are new to the call that want to take a look back at some of our previous webinars, the link there is from our website. You can also go on our website. One of the drop downs is play, and webinars is listed on there. So that'll have a link to all our recordings. We do have one more future presentation scheduled. It is for tomorrow, Thursday, same time, 10 a.m. It will be presented by John Manos from our staff, and we'll have a guest from the USGA to explain slope rating. So if you guys aren't signed up and are interested in that, you can do that on our GAP webinar page as well. So again, thank you for joining today. We will wrap up with any last questions that came in. So Jason?
Yep. And just another reminder, Steve, we will have more webinars being announced soon, so just keep your eye on your email as we'll be sending that out to all of the membership. So one question trickled in here, Steve. How would you post a score in a situation where a course is altered due to certain holes being closed, but you are playing 3 holes twice in order to get an 18-hole score?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think that would kind of be a one-off question that we would answer offline, because it's clear that there's probably something going on at the course that might require a temporary solution, whether it be our rating team to come out and rate a subset of the holes. So that's something we can answer offline.
And another quick one here for you. Is a C score different than the old T score, which had a lot of restrictions?
So it's designated the same way in the system, but with the new exceptional score reduction, that replaces the old section 10.3 of the USGA handicap system manual. So that looked at if you had 2 scores that were 3 greater or 3 below your handicap index, that you could have a potential reduction. The new competition or C score does not do that anymore, but again, it can be used for filtering. So it's not as important with the designation, but if the handicap committee wanted to look at a certain player and see how they performed in competition, being able to filter out just by those competition scores would be the value there.
Perfect. Well, that looks like the end of our questions here. Just a reminder, you can always reach out to any of us on staff with any additional questions that you may have. All of our contact information is listed on the website. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today, taking the time to explain some of these things. And thank you all again for attending today's webinar.